What is this place?
Welcome to Cloud 9.
How exactly did I get here?
You're a Toyota Crown driver, and only Crown drivers ever reach this level of pure bliss.
The captivating Toyota Crown family. Toyota, let's go places.
Looking for a great non-alcoholic beer?
Yeah.
Try Athletic Brewing Co.
One that actually
Tastes great? It's athletic.
Or that has a
variety of styles? It's athletic.
Or
that's award-winning and seemingly everywhere? It's athletic. Just ask for it.
Okay. Can I get an athletic?
Sure can. The rest of you, go to askforathletic.com and find the #1 non-alcoholic beer brand in the U.S. at a retailer today. Near Beer.
Support for this podcast comes from CDTA, The Eagle, a Times Union podcast driven by CDTA. Hey, it's Jessica Marshall with another episode of The Eagle, a Times Union podcast. We produce multiple podcasts here at the Times Union. Of course, we have The Eagle, our weekly news podcast, which you're listening to right now, but we also have 2 active limited series podcasts, and this was a monumentally busy week for all 3 of them. We finished the 12-episode arc of Catastrophic Failure on Tuesday. That's our story of the Schoharie limo crash. It was the culmination of a year and a half of intense production and 6 years of intense reporting by our own Larry Rulison. It's not an easy story to hear, I'm going to be honest, but it's an incredibly important one. You can find it on all major podcast apps. We also have Rainwalker, the Lost Boy, which is our deep dive into the unsolved case of 12-year-old Jaliek Rainwalker. He went missing in 2007 from Greenwich, New York. Police say he was murdered, but his remains have never been found, and no one's ever been charged. You can count on another episode of Rainwalker forthcoming. There were some big developments related to the 17-year-old cold case this week. We're going to talk about them on this episode of The Eagle, too. Here's the gist of what happened. It started Sunday night with a woman walking her cat by Burden Pond in South Troy. She came upon what looked like a human skull. And yes, you heard that right. She was walking her cat. And she found a skull. Troy police checked it out, and it was indeed human remains. They looked to be those of an individual in their mid to late teens after early examination. And then, more law enforcement descended on the site. They found more bones, some ribs, and they called Barbara Reilly. Now, if you've listened to Rainwalker or read anything about Jaliek's case, you will know that Barbara Reilly is Jaliek's adoptive grandmother. She's been searching for him for almost 2 decades. Police told her that they found human remains and that there was a possibility that they could be Jaliek's. Far from a certainty, of course, but there were enough potential connections to investigate it. In the summer of 2022, police searched an area very close to Burden Pond in connection with Jaliek's case. They didn't find anything, or at least they didn't share with the public that they'd found anything. Now, more than 2 years later, the bones of a teenager show up in the same area? That was intriguing enough to draw Washington County District Attorney Tony Jordan to the scene. He showed up at the site Monday, along with Rensselaer County District Attorney Mary Pat Donnelly. Back in 2008, Cambridge Greenwich Police Chief George Bell told media that FBI analysis of cell phone records suggested that Jaliek was in South Troy with his adoptive father, Stephen Kerr, at one point on the night that he disappeared. It's not definitive proof of anything, though, according to the FBI, because cell phone technology in 2007, it's far less advanced than it is today, and the data that they had access to then wasn't the most reliable. For 3 days this week, social media lit up with people speculating about whether the remains were Jaliek's. Traffic on our Rainwalker podcast spiked. The region seemed to be waiting with bated breath for confirmation that it was Jaliek. But it wasn't. An analysis of dental records ruled out Jaliek Rainwalker. And that left the question, whose remains were they then? Times Union reporter Patrick Tyne has been covering the developments all week. He was on the scene Monday and Tuesday in Troy as police removed the remains for testing and identification. Patrick joins me now on the Eagle with the latest. All right, so this is another one of those times, which actually it happens a lot now, where we've recorded a whole segment on a particular, piece of news, only to have it completely get upended and have to re-record. So here we are today. That is exactly what happened in this case. So bones, remains, a skull, some ribs were discovered in a Troy park. Everybody kind of suspected that it might have been Jaliek Rainwalker. Law enforcement even suspected that it might have been him because, they called the DA, they called Jaliek Rainwalker's adopted grandmother. Like, there was a lot of speculation that this could be Jaliek Rainwalker. However, so on Wednesday, tell us what happened.
So on Wednesday afternoon, not long after we recorded our conversation, news broke that a source close to the investigation had confirmed that the remains found Sunday into Monday were not Jaliek Rainwalker. And then that was shortly confirmed by a news release put out by the Troy Police Department, their Assistant Chief, Stephen Barker, saying that that was the case and that a family member had been notified and that they were still obviously working to identify those remains. That's still
right. So that's the big question, right? So it's not Jaliek Rainwalker, which I know has disappointed a lot of hopeful people because that case is, 17 years remains unsolved. His remains had never been found. The police say he'd been murdered. So there was a lot of hope that that would be him. But now that it's not him, the investigators still have to figure out who it is because it was someone, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's still a lot of unanswered questions. There's still a lot of questions that we're trying to find out in connection to whether or not it was Jaliek, because we know that the bones themselves belong to a person. They said it was a non-adult human, maybe mid to late adolescent. But we don't know if that person died, in 2007 or in 1907 or in 1807 at this point. We don't know that. We don't know the gender. And as I was kind of writing our kind of breaking story on this yesterday, at the end, it was important to realize there have been several dozen people that have gone missing since like the 70s in the area that are in roughly that age range. So, got that into the story there. So that is something that we still want to know. The police have said that they are going to work to continue to make those determinations and hopefully an ID sometime. They said the beginning of next week, but it's unclear if they mean they're going to start a more intensive process of identification or they'll have something to give the public. But I think things will become a little clearer next week, but nothing is certain, as we certainly have learned over the last 4 days.
So they confirmed that these remains were not Jaliek Rainwalker via dental records, right?
Yes.
Going forward, have police and law enforcement, given any indication as to how they're going to figure out who it is? Are they going to use DNA? Are they going to use something like, genetic genealogy? Or, is that still under wraps?
I do know that they had told Barbara Reilly that they were confident that they were able to get DNA from the remains that were recovered. So presumably they could still test that and try to determine who those remains belong to. That would be my guess, but I do know that is a longer process than for a forensic anthropology type analysis.
So the first time we talked, we discussed the fact that you had never covered any case involving Jaliek Rainwalker or any circumstance involving Jaliek Rainwalker news, like whether remains had been found or anything else. This was sort of your first time touching this story. There was a lot of excitement and hopefulness around the fact that people wanted this to be Jaliek. Like how did you tackle that as a reporter? How did you obviously you can't speculate, but there was a lot of speculation. So how do you deal with that?
Certainly. Well, you have to remember first that this is a person, and there are people that are very close, especially his adoptive grandmother, who are really hurting right now. Speculation online and amateur sleuths and people that kind of view this as a hobby, you have to remember these are real human beings. But as a reporter, and it wasn't just me, but it was a lot of editors in the newsroom, just making sure that we were balancing everything that we're seeing at the scene and every single fact with the broader context of what this meant, and seeing that, they don't normally bring the DAs from 2 counties to a search site or a site where police are looking for things, every time, and knowing that they had been in communication with Barbara. So we tried to get that kind of balance into the coverage, and we ideally, and going back and looking at the stories that were written, we didn't put our thumb on the scale in the slightest in terms of trying to intimate one way or the other, whether or not this was him. We never got ahead of the story in a way that would make us regretful based on the news that we got yesterday.
Including Jaliek Rainwalker's name in the headline and in the body of the article made sense because, like you said, the DA showed up, Barbara was called. You have to weigh that very carefully as you report any case of remains, right, that are found.
Going back to the first part of your other question of just being there and covering it, I mean, these are the sort of things that you certainly, if you're in this sort of job, you want to be the person that, they call your number to go cover it, because it's such a big story. It does matter to so many people. And you saw that as I spent the whole day down on Campbell Avenue and talking to people. I would say a majority of people I talked to, were familiar with the case and cared about Jaliek, and just as a person who they knew in the news. It was meaningful in that way as well.
For updates on the identity of the remains found in Troy, stick by timesunion.com or any of our social channels. And for more about Jaliek Rainwalker and his story, check out our limited series podcast, Rainwalker, the Lost Boy. It's available at timesunion.com and on all major podcast apps. That's it for this week. The Eagle is a production of the Times-Union. It's produced and edited by myself, Jessica Marshall, with help from the Times-Union digital team and the newsroom. Our music is Flyin' by Top Floor. Questions or comments? Email us at podcast@timesunion.com. Support for this podcast comes from CDTA, The Eagle, a Times Union podcast driven by CDTA.